What did medieval nuns
Please,
actually do
have
all
mercy
day?
on us.
Hey everyone, tonight
We are
we're
freezing.
drifting back
We
to
are
a quieter
starving.
world. A world of candlelight, ink-stained fingers, and soft footsteps echoing through cold
O
stone
Lord,
corridors.
open thou our lips,
A
and our
world
mouth
where
shall show
silence
forth
was
thy
sacred,
praise. O God,
at
make
least
speed to
in
save
theory, and gossip was considered a form of spiritual cardio. So, dim your lights, settle in, and let's wander gently through the cloistered lives of medieval nuns. Women who were supposed to spend their days in
Ora
prayer
pro
and
nobis
contemplation,
peccatoribus nunc,
but
et
who,
in
as it
hora
turns
mortem
out,
nostrae.
were often far
Amen.
busier, stranger, and occasionally drunker than anyone expected. Because, for all the piety and chanting, the convents of medieval Europe were far from the serene havens of pure devotion that we like to imagine. They were small, self-contained worlds, with their own rivalries, economies, and scandals. In some cases, they resembled more of a ladies' boarding school that forgot to invent supervision. Let's start at the beginning, or at least
And so
the
we
morning.
pursue knowledge, each in our own way.
Mornings
for the
in the
betterment of all.
cloister.
Indeed, sister.
Embrace the spirit
Nun's
of
day
creativity.
began early,
We shall
painfully
make our own
early.
interpretations.
Before sunrise, bells would ring through the convent,
Let us consider
calling
how
everyone to
apply these
matins,
rules
the
creatively.
first of several daily prayer sessions, depending on the century and the rule being followed. Benedictine, Cistercian, Augustinian, or any of the others. There could be between 7 and 8 separate services every single day. You might think that would leave no
Please,
time
we
for
are
anything
so
else.
cold and hungry.
But the human spirit,
We need help.
especially the medieval one, had an incredible talent for creative interpretation. So, yes, technically, the day began with prayer, but in practice, matins often blurred into a sleepy mumble of half-remembered psalms. Some nuns were known to lean against the wall to stay upright during the longer chants. Others discreetly napped between verses. It's not exactly heresy, just gravity doing its best work before breakfast. After matins came lauds, then a brief pause for what might generously be called breakfast. Usually, this meant bread, sometimes cheese, and on especially blessed days, beer.
She brings with
Monastic
her
beer
a pure
was
heart.
thick, nutritious,
welcome
and
her with
mercifully
open arms.
alcoholic. It also made fasting
We
seasons
offer
more
our
bearable,
daughter to God's
since
service.
technically liquid didn't
Welcome,
break a
child,
fast.
to our holy sanctuary.
Naturally, medieval Christians leaned
We bring
heavily
her to
on
your
that
care,
loophole,
Abbess.
the rule of Saint Benedict.
She
Sort of
is
the
ready.
backbone of convent
Welcome,
life was the
child.
rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century guidebook that was supposed to structure every hour of a monk or nun's existence. It emphasized humility, obedience, and balance, a life of quiet discipline. But, like all rule books, it was open to a little interpretation. For example, Benedict's rule stated that nuns should live in poverty. Yet by the 13th century, many convents were quite well off, thanks to generous donations from noble families eager to earn heavenly points or stash away inconvenient daughters. So, while peasants starved outside the walls, some abbesses enjoyed private chambers, fine linens, and even personal servants. Poverty, it seemed, was a flexible concept. In theory, nuns also took a vow of silence. In practice, they invented the sign language loophole. Hundreds of silent gestures were developed across medieval Europe for things like bread, book, or please, hand me that chicken. Entire conversations could unfold, with no words at all. Imagine a medieval game of charades where the stakes were eternal, salvation. And then, of course, there were exceptions for holy discussion, which, coincidentally, covered most topics of daily interest, from who misplaced the choir, books to whether Sister Agnes was once again overcooking the fish. The many reasons women became. Nuns, not everyone joined the convent out of divine inspiration. In fact, relatively few did. Some were the spare daughters of noble families, too plain to marry well, too wealthy to let wander freely. A convent was the ideal solution, spiritually respectable, financially contained, and conveniently out of the way. A sort of medieval boarding school with eternal enrollment. Others joined for safety. In an age of plague, war, and men with swords who thought they were interesting, the cloister offered protection. Behind its thick stone walls, a woman could live her life without worrying about being married off, sold off, or set on fire for witchcraft. At least, not immediately. But some women chose the life willingly. They sought learning, solitude, and a kind of independence almost impossible elsewhere. In the convent, a woman could read, write, paint, teach, manage property, and even lead a community, all under the respectable cover of holiness. So while monks were busy copying manuscripts and debating theology, many nuns quietly built their own miniature worlds of intellect and administration. They were librarians, musicians, herbalists, and scribes, and occasionally poets whose works were just a little too passionate for the church's comfort. Love letters and locked gates. Yes, love, because, naturally, even behind stone walls, human nature found a way. Convents had strict enclosure rules. Nuns were supposed to stay within the walls for life, and men were forbidden to enter. In practice, however, a steady trickle of priests, confessors, visiting relatives, and workmen made sure the gates were rarely still. Letters passed hands. So did gifts. And sometimes, affections. One 13th century abbess in France was discovered writing love poetry to a local monk. Another nun in England kept a pet dog named Cupid. Subtle. Perhaps the most famous, scandal came from Heloise and Abelard, though technically she became a nun only after their very public affair. Still, their letters reveal that even within holy orders, the longing for human connection never quite vanished. Church authorities, of course, responded with helpful rules. Nuns were to be strictly supervised. Windows between convents and the outside world were to have iron grills. Visitors must speak through barriers, and only during daylight. This, predictably, only made the idea of romance more interesting. Work, prayer, and unexpected professions when not praying. Which, to be fair, was most of the day. Nuns worked, but work in a medieval convent could mean a surprising range of things. Some embroidered altar cloths or copied manuscripts by candlelight, producing stunning works of art that still survive. Others managed estates, collecting rents and overseeing farms. A few even brewed beer or distilled herbal remedies, selling them to local townsfolk to fund the convent. In Germany, the nuns of Lune specialized in illuminated manuscripts, producing gold-leafed devotional books that shimmered like treasure. In England, the sisters at Barking Abbey became renowned for their literary output. They wrote plays, hymns, and theological treatises. Meanwhile, in Italy, certain convents developed reputations for baking and cheese-making, which feels delightfully wholesome until you realize that half their profits came from supplying indulgent bishops. And then there were the musicians. Some convents maintained small choirs and even orchestras, performing complex polyphonic music during services. Their compositions, rarely credited by name, were among the earliest examples of female-written European music. So while the outside world imagined them as silent, veiled women at prayer, many nuns spent their days rehearsing harmonies in Latin, and occasionally arguing about who had stolen the good psalter. The not-so-holy side of convent life. Of course, where there's community, there's conflict. Documents. From visitation records, the Church's version of surprise inspections reveal that medieval convents were not exactly peaceful havens of obedience. Inspectors complained of irreverent laughter, scandalous clothing, and unlawful dancing. At one convent, nuns were accused of keeping pet birds in the chapel. At another, of hosting men for late-night spiritual discussions. One English abbess in the 14th century was said to have thrown dinner parties for her friends, complete with wine, roast meats, and musicians, all paid for with convent funds. Her defense: hospitality is a virtue. Some nuns were caught smuggling sweets into their dormitories. Others maintained secret wardrobes of colored gowns beneath their habits, and at least one was found hiding a mirror, which was strictly forbidden. Vanity being a sin, after all, it seems that even in the holiest of places, the temptation to bend the rules for comfort or curiosity was hard to resist. Food, fasting, and the joy of cheating at Lent-lets. Talk about food. Because medieval religious life was essentially a centuries-long experiment in finding new ways to eat while technically fasting. 7c. Church calendar was packed with fasting days, Advent, Lent, and countless feast eves. During these times, meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed, and so were birds. If one could argue that they came from the sea, hence the popular medieval belief that beavers counted as fish. It was the tale. Very scaly, apparently convincing. Inside the convent, meals were eaten in silence, while one sister read aloud from Scripture. Except, of course, during feast days, when silence relaxed, and so did everyone's self-restraint. Wine flowed, pastries appeared, and a festive mood crept through the refectory like incense smoke. After all, the saints never said holiness couldn't be delicious. Mystics, visions, and spiritual showmanship. Not all nuns were content with embroidery and quiet prayer. Some became mystics, women who claimed direct experiences of the divine. They saw visions, heard voices, and occasionally levitated during ecstatic prayer. Or at least, that's what their sisters swore under oath. She wrote music, books, and theological treatises, and corresponded with popes and emperors who politely pretended they understood her metaphors. How did people in ancient times keep themselves clean? Spoiler, they mostly didn't. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back through time to an age before soap smelled like lavender, before showers had water pressure, and before the concept of personal hygiene had even been invented. So, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe light a candle if you're feeling historically accurate. Settle into your blanket and prepare yourself for the soft, slightly grim realization that most of human history smelled absolutely terrible. This is the story of how ancient people kept themselves clean, or rather, how they thought they did. Let's start with a truth that's a little hard to wrap our modern, freshly shampooed heads around. For most of history, being clean wasn't really about health. It was about status. You washed not because you feared bacteria, no one knew bacteria existed, but because it made you look like you had leisure time. If you could afford to bathe, that meant you weren't out plowing a field or sweating in a forge. You were rich enough to sit around and let someone else haul the water for you. So when we say people didn't bathe much, what we really mean is that people didn't have the means, or the time, or sometimes even the philosophical belief system that would encourage bathing. Because, yes, at certain points in history, people genuinely thought water was dangerous. Let's drift back to the ancient world, to the early civilizations where bathing was, surprisingly, a bit of an art form. Take ancient Egypt, for example. The Egyptians were early believers in cleanliness, though in their defense, the desert climate probably helped. If you're constantly dusty and sweating under linen robes, you either bathe or you start resembling a human loaf of bread. They bathed daily, sometimes several times a day, using a paste made of natron, a naturally occurring mix of salt and soda ash, and occasionally honey or milk if you were fancy. This wasn't quite soap, but it did the job. Even the poor might scrub themselves with sand or clay. And since Egypt was big on religious purity, priests were expected to be exceptionally clean, shaving their entire bodies and washing several times a day before rituals. So, yes, ancient Egypt, clean, perfumed, oiled, and surprisingly modern in their approach to not smelling like death. Of course, this didn't last forever. Now, let's drift over to Greece. The Greeks had an interesting relationship with bathing. They did it often, but not necessarily in the way we might think. You might picture a marble bath full of scented water, but in reality, most Greeks cleaned themselves with olive oil. That's right, olive oil. They'd slather it on and then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. This removed dirt, sweat, and a thin layer of your dignity. Afterward, they'd apply a bit of perfumed oil, because smelling like yesterday's gym class was a universal faux pas even in 500 BC. Public baths were also common, not as luxurious as Roman ones later would be, but still a place to relax, chat, and perform the ancient equivalent of gossiping about your neighbor's sandals. Then came the Romans, who, in typical Roman fashion, took the idea of bathing and turned it into a competitive sport. If there was one thing the Romans loved more than conquering other people's lands, it was conquering filth. They built enormous bath complexes, the thermae, some of which could hold thousands of people. The baths of Caracalla, for example, had hot rooms, cold rooms, steam rooms, swimming pools, exercise courts, libraries, and even snack bars, because, of course, nothing says civilization quite like sweating in a marble sauna, and then immediately eating honey cakes. Bathing was so central to Roman life that if you didn't go, people assumed something was wrong with you. It was social, it was relaxing, and, crucially, it was affordable. Even the poor could enjoy a good soak, because the emperor subsidized bathhouses, a sort of public works project for cleanliness. Soap still wasn't really a thing. Instead, they used olive oil like the Greeks, sometimes mixed with ash. They scraped, they soaked, and they steamed themselves into oblivion. It was, in every sense, peak cleanliness for the ancient world. Then, everything fell apart. When the Roman Empire collapsed, so did its plumbing, and with it went most of Europe's enthusiasm for washing. The great aqueducts fell into disrepair. The bathhouses crumbled, and people gradually decided that getting wet was overrated. But not right away. There were still bathhouses across medieval Europe for several centuries after Rome's fall. People would pay to go soak in hot tubs with their neighbors. And yes, these were sometimes exactly as scandalous as that sounds. By the 13th century, though, things began to change. Public baths started to get a bad reputation. The Crusades brought back more than just silk and spices. They also brought new diseases. And when the Black Death hit, bathing got suspicious. People thought hot water opened the pores, and open pores let in miasmas, or bad air, which supposedly carried the plague. So naturally, to avoid disease, people stopped washing. Entirely. It was a bit like deciding the solution to bad weather is to never look at the sky again. Let's pause there for a moment and appreciate this remarkable historical pivot. The world went from the Romans, who built heated marble pools just to soak in, to medieval Europeans who thought a bucket of warm water was basically a weapon of biological warfare. This was the age when changing your shirt counted as personal hygiene. Bathing, when it happened, was rare and cautious. The wealthy might sit in a wooden tub once or twice a year, surrounded by attendants holding towels and strong opinions. The poor usually had to make do with wiping themselves down with a damp rag. Perfume, however, made a triumphant comeback. Instead of washing, nobles simply drowned their odors in musk, rosewater, or whatever pungent mixture could overpower unwashed human. Queen Elizabeth II, for example, reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, things smelled a bit better. Islamic cultures, for instance, maintained strong traditions of cleanliness. The Quran emphasizes washing before prayer, so frequent bathing was both a spiritual and practical act. Public baths, hammams, flourished throughout the Islamic world. These were elegant, domed buildings filled with steam, soap, and conversation. You'd bathe, get a massage, gossip a little, and leave cleaner than anyone in medieval Paris could dream of. Similarly, in Japan, bathing remained central to daily life for centuries. The Japanese onsen, hot spring culture is ancient, dating back over 1,000 years. Cleanliness wasn't just about appearance. It was about purity and calmness. So while Europeans were busy fearing warm water, half the world was blissfully soaking in it. Eventually, though, Europe began to catch up again. Very slowly and somewhat reluctantly. During the Renaissance, hygiene was still iffy, but perfumes and powders were more sophisticated. People began to wash their hands and faces more often, though full baths were still a rare luxury. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the upper classes favored linen undergarments, lots of them, which were thought to absorb dirt from the skin. This led to the genuinely hilarious belief that as long as you changed your shirt often, you didn't actually need to wash your body. There's a famous quote from the 17th century, "Changing linen refreshes the body." And in a sense, yes, if by refreshes you mean gently rearranges the grime. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, reportedly hated bathing. He claimed water made him ill. Instead, he relied on perfumes, powders, and endless clean linen. It's said he only bathed twice in his entire life. 2 times. One of the most powerful men in Europe, ruling over Versailles, bathed about as often as your average cat. But by the 18th century's end, things began to shift. The Enlightenment brought with it new scientific thinking, and medicine began to connect hygiene, actual hygiene, with health. Doctors started recommending washing with soap and water to prevent disease. Public bathhouses made a comeback, and indoor plumbing slowly entered homes. Soap production increased, now made with fats and lye instead of oil and ash. The first modern bars of soap appeared, marketed as luxuries, then eventually as necessities. By the 19th century, with urbanization and epidemics, governments began promoting cleanliness as a civic duty. Posters encouraged regular bathing. Soap became patriotic. And at last, after thousands of years of scraping oil, avoiding water, and hoping perfumes could do all the heavy lifting, people started to actually be clean. Let's start with a truth that's a little hard to wrap our modern, freshly shampooed heads around. For most of history, being clean wasn't really about health. It was about status. You washed not because you feared bacteria, no one knew bacteria existed, but because it made you look like you had leisure time. If you could afford to bathe, that meant you weren't out plowing a field or sweating in a forge. You were rich enough to sit around and let someone else haul the water for you. It's a comforting thought, really, that after millennia of trial and error, of dirt and superstition, humanity finally decided that hygiene wasn't just vanity, it was survival. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, maybe be a little grateful for your warm shower and your fresh bed sheets. Somewhere deep in history, a Roman is nodding approvingly from his marble bath. And somewhere else, Louis XIV is still refusing to get in the tub. What happened to the corpses after public executions? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when public squares doubled as theaters. Executioners were minor celebrities, and death was a community event you could bring the kids to. You know, simpler times. So, go ahead, dim the lights. Maybe pull your blanket up a little higher. Because tonight's story is about what came after the show was over. When the cheering died down and the crowd went home, and the executioner was left standing beside the body. Or sometimes several of them, wondering what exactly to do next. We're not talking about the act itself. We're talking about the cleanup. Because for centuries, execution wasn't just a punishment. It was a kind of public lesson, a morality play with a corpse as the final prop. And, like any good prop, that corpse had to be managed. So, tonight we'll drift gently through the post-mortem bureaucracy of history. Through the royal decrees that decided who got buried, who got displayed, and who got quietly dumped into a ditch behind the gallows. Let's start, as these things often do, with the Middle Ages, the golden age of public execution, and the birthplace of many very creative ideas about what to do with a body. First, it's worth remembering that executions weren't really about justice, at least not in the modern sense. They were about example. You didn't just punish someone. You showed everyone else what happened when they misbehaved, and what better reminder could there be than leaving a piece of the offender hanging around for a few weeks? Literally, when someone was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the English crown's favorite performance art for treason. Their remains were part of the message. After the execution, the head would be tarred to slow down decay, and then mounted on a pike, usually over London Bridge, where it could be admired by travelers coming into the city. It was a surprisingly crowded space up there, heads belonging to traitors, rebels, and the occasional unlucky nobleman, all gently decaying in the breeze. People would even note how long a head lasted before it fell apart, as though they were rating it like produce. The rest of the body was divided into quarters. The weak, classic medieval serving size, and sent to different towns as a kind of royal postcard. Greetings from the king. Here's a leg of someone who annoyed him. It sounds grotesque, and it was, but it worked. Bodies were messages, and everyone could read them. Now, not everyone's remains got such deluxe treatment. Most executed people, especially common criminals, were just buried nearby. Sometimes there'd be a small patch of ground near the gallows known as the gallows field or dead man's acre. It wasn't consecrated because these were sinners, officially. They didn't deserve holy ground, so they were laid in shallow graves, often still in the clothes they died in. Sometimes with their hands bound, there are records of villagers digging up gallows fields centuries later and finding skeletons still tangled in ropes. It's an unsettling image, but also a strangely peaceful one. The crowd gone, the noise gone, just a quiet field full of the forgotten. But sometimes the body story was only beginning. Let's drift over to the 16th and 17th centuries, when something new was happening. Science was stirring. Doctors were getting ambitious. And for the first time, the human body wasn't just a vessel for sin, it was a potential teaching aid. Dissection had been taboo for centuries, but that started to change. By the Renaissance, medical schools needed cadavers, and society, ever practical, decided criminals would do nicely. In England, this was formalized by the Murder Act of 1752. It stated that the bodies of executed murderers would either be publicly dissected or hung in chains, a process known as gibbeting. Either way, you were guaranteed an encore. Public dissections drew enormous crowds. People would pay to watch as surgeons lectured over the body, occasionally waving bits of it around for emphasis. In theory, this was about advancing medical knowledge. In practice, it was a little bit of both science and spectacle. The audience wasn't always composed of scholars, either. Curious townsfolk came too, because who wouldn't want to see inside a criminal? It was macabre, yes, but it was also another layer of punishment. Your body became evidence of your guilt, long after your soul had presumably moved on. Gibbeting was even worse. After execution, the body would be dipped in tar, again for preservation, and locked inside an iron cage shaped roughly like a human body. Then it would be hung from a tall post by a roadside, to creak in the wind for weeks or months. The idea was that everyone traveling past would see the corpse, swinging gently in the breeze, and think twice. About crime, it rarely worked, but it did make navigation easier. Travelers could give directions like, "Turn left at the murderer," which must have been convenient, if not entirely appetizing. There's a recorded case from 1752, the same year the Murder Act was passed, where a man named William Quarterman was gibbeted in Sussex. His body reportedly hung there for over 20 years, until it finally fell apart. Locals said the bones made noises at night when the wind blew through the cage. Nothing like a bit of rural ambience. And yet, for all the public horror, there were still moments of strange tenderness. Sometimes, families begged for the body. If they were wealthy enough or persuasive enough, they could bribe the executioner or the sheriff to return the remains for burial. In other cases, sympathetic bystanders would collect the pieces themselves. There are accounts of crowds scattering to retrieve a finger, a lock of hair, a bit of fabric. Morbid souvenirs, yes, but also a kind of resistance. To take the condemned's remains was to reclaim their humanity. Executioners themselves often had a complicated relationship with these bodies. They weren't just killers. They were also cleaners, undertakers, and occasional smugglers. In some cities, the executioner had the official right to the clothing of the condemned. In others, he kept the rope. Some made extra money selling parts of the rope as lucky charms. Macabre, but highly profitable. The fat from hanged men, known as gallows grease, was sometimes sold as a cure-all ointment. It supposedly healed wounds and eased joint pain. We'll skip over the details of how it was collected. Mostly because it's exactly as you're imagining. Let's drift over to France for a moment. During the Reign of Terror, when the guillotine was working overtime, the cleanup became an industrial operation. After each day's executions, carts carried the bodies, sometimes dozens at a time, to nearby cemeteries. One of the most famous was the Madeleine Cemetery, where the remains of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were dumped in unmarked pits. Gravediggers worked quickly, sprinkling lime over the bodies to control the smell. They didn't bother with coffins, just layers of corpses, earth and lime stacked like grim lasagna. When the political tides shifted a few years later, and people wanted to give the royals a proper burial, it took considerable detective work to figure out which bones were whose. They were eventually moved to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, or at least the bones believed to be theirs were. At that point, everyone agreed it was close enough. By the 19th century, the spectacle of public execution began to fade. Cities were modernizing. The same sensibility that found the smell of open sewers distasteful also began to find public hangings a bit gauche. Executions moved behind prison walls, out of sight. And with that shift, the corpses themselves became less public too. No more heads on spikes, no more gibbets creaking by the roadside. Bodies were now quietly buried in prison yards, marked by nothing more than a patch of disturbed soil. Sometimes the burial was deliberately secret. Officials feared that sympathizers might turn a criminal's grave into a shrine. Even in death, politics lingered. Of course, the fascination never really went away. In the Victorian era, crime scene tourism was a respectable pastime. People visited the sites of famous executions, collected relics, and wrote long sentimental poems about murderers who died bravely upon the scaffold. It was all very moralizing and slightly hypocritical, which, to be fair, describes much of Victorian culture. By then, anatomy schools still needed cadavers, but stealing them from graves had become illegal. So the state continued to supply executed criminals to medical institutions, up until the death penalty itself began to vanish. It's strange to think that some of the first steps toward modern medical understanding, the mapping of muscles, veins, and organs, came from bodies that once dangled from the gallows. Human knowledge, built quite literally on the condemned. Let's pause here for a moment and imagine the quiet after it all. The crowd dispersed, the scaffold empty. A few workmen sweeping sawdust into piles, the smell of iron and wood still hanging in the air. Somewhere nearby, a cart creaks away, carrying what's left of the day's lesson. History tends to remember the crimes, the trials, the final words, but not what happened in the hour afterward, when someone had to decide what to do with the remains. And that, perhaps, is the most human part of all, because no matter how terrible the crime, someone still had to lift the body, someone still had to dig the hole, and someone, inevitably, still had to wash their hands afterward. What did medieval peasants actually eat, and how bad was it? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, a world of castles and cathedrals, knights and plagues, and, most importantly, food that could probably qualify as a war crime by modern standards. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, ideally one that isn't made of bark or fermented fish, because we're about to spend the next little while exploring what ordinary people, not the kings or knights, but the peasants, actually ate, and, perhaps more importantly, how on earth they survived it. Let's start by setting the scene. Imagine a small medieval village, muddy, quiet. A few chickens wandering around, all of them looking vaguely annoyed. The air smells faintly of smoke, wet straw, and despair. In the center of it all stands a single wooden hut with a thatched roof, the kind that leaks whenever it rains, which is often. Inside, a family huddles near a smoky hearth, trying to cook dinner. Now, when I say dinner, I don't mean a roast chicken or a loaf of fresh bread. I mean something brown, possibly bubbling, and definitely unidentifiable. That brown, bubbling thing was most likely pottage, the great peasant staple. Pottage was the great equalizer of the medieval diet. A stew-like mixture that was, Essentially, whatever you could throw into a pot without dying. Grains, water, onions if you were lucky, and weeds if you weren't. It simmered all day over the fire, thickening into something halfway between soup and glue. You could add bits of barley, peas, leeks, or even cabbage. On feast days, you might find a shred of bacon floating in it, like a surprise from the universe reminding you that meat still existed. It wasn't bad exactly, just relentlessly monotonous. And yet, pottage was the cornerstone of peasant survival. It was cheap, filling, and crucially, it could be endlessly recycled. You could just keep topping it up every day with a little more grain or water. Some historians believe a single pot might have been reheated for weeks on end, acquiring the kind of flavor that only time and mild rot can provide. Water in the Middle Ages was often unsafe to drink, since sanitation wasn't exactly a strong point. So, low-alcohol ale was the drink of choice for everyone, even children. Because nothing says good morning like a nice, tepid cup of mildly alcoholic grain juice. They called it small beer, and it was basically what happened when you brewed beer, then watered it down until it was slightly sad. But it did the job. It was hydrating, calorie-rich, and, most importantly, not full of dysentery. Now, about the bread. Forget the fluffy, golden loaves we picture today. Medieval bread for peasants was dense, hard, often grayish in color. The reason was simple. They couldn't afford pure wheat flour. Wheat was expensive and usually reserved for the upper classes. Peasants made bread from rye, barley, oats, or whatever grain hadn't molded yet. Sometimes they mixed in things like beans or acorns, which technically worked, though the flavor was described by one 14th-century monk as better suited for the pigs. And then there was maslin bread, a cheerful mix of rye and wheat that baked into a loaf both sour and bitter, perfect for someone who couldn't afford either grain properly. The bread of desperation. During bad harvest years, things got grim. If grain was scarce, peasants stretched it with whatever they could find. Dried peas, bean flour, sawdust, or even tree bark. Yes, tree bark. The inner bark of certain trees could be ground up and added to flour. It wasn't nutritious or delicious or remotely edible by modern standards, but it filled the stomach, which was often all that mattered. This kind of bread even had a name. Famine. Bread. It was dark, coarse and crumbly, less of a loaf, more of an act of desperation. Chroniclers described it as bitter, dry, and faintly toxic. But, in a world where starvation was always a season away, you ate what you had. Let's wander a bit further into the field, quite literally, because peasants spent most of their waking hours there. A peasant's diet was defined by the seasons. There were no supermarkets, no cold storage, and definitely no convenient drive-through options. So everything revolved around the rhythm of the agricultural year. In spring, you might eat whatever wild greens managed to sprout, things like nettles, sorrel, and dandelion leaves. They weren't luxurious, but they provided much-needed vitamins after a long winter of eating dried grain and regret. Summer was better. Fresh peas, beans, leeks, onions. Occasionally, if the harvest was good and the Lord wasn't too greedy, you might get to keep some of your own grain. Then came autumn, harvest time. For a few glorious weeks, life was full of abundance. Bread ovens glowed, beer brewed, apples were dried for storage, and for once, everyone could eat until they weren't hungry. And then winter arrived, and everything died again. The hungry season, winter, was brutal. But the real threat came in spring, during what was ominously called the hungry gap. That's the period after the winter stores ran out, but before the new crops were ready. Fields were still bare, and granaries were nearly empty. Peasants often resorted to eating whatever was left. Old, moldy grain, dried beans, or salted fish that had seen better centuries. Malnutrition was rampant. Children suffered from rickets, adults from anemia, and yet somehow life went on, because it had to. Speaking of salted fish, let's talk about Fish Fridays. The church had a lot to say about what you could and couldn't eat, especially when it came to meat. Fridays, Lent, and various other holy days were designated as fasting days. This didn't mean you couldn't eat anything, just no meat from land animals. Fish, however, was allowed. For nobles, that might mean fresh salmon or eels from their private ponds. For peasants, it meant, well, salted herring. Again. Always herring. Salted, smoked, dried, or pickled. Fish was the medieval tofu. It appeared everywhere, tasted of nothing, and was only truly enjoyable if you hadn't eaten for several days. Salted fish also doubled as a kind of currency. Merchants traded it across Europe, and monasteries stored it in bulk. The smell must have been magnificent. And what about meat? For most peasants, meat was a theoretical concept, something they knew existed, but rarely encountered. A peasant might get a bit of bacon fat to flavor pottage, or a sliver of pork on a feast day. If you were really lucky, you might have a chicken. But chickens were valuable for their eggs, so you didn't eat them unless they stopped laying, or died of old age, which, unsurprisingly, didn't improve the taste. Game animals like deer or boar were off limits. Those belonged to the Lord. Poaching could get you fined, imprisoned, or executed. Depending on how moody your local nobleman was that week, some people took the risk anyway, and some, when caught, were punished with ironic efficiency by being fed to the Lord's hunting dogs. So yes, most peasants didn't eat much meat, but at least the system was consistent in its cruelty. Let's drift into the topic of dairy. Milk, cheese, and butter were essential, but, as with everything else, highly seasonal. Milk was plentiful in summer, scarce in winter. Butter was often salted to keep it from spoiling, and cheese, well, cheese was everyone's best friend. It stored well, provided protein, and could be made from anything that produced milk. Cows, goats, sheep, even the occasional mare if times were weird. Soft cheeses were eaten quickly. Hard cheeses lasted for months, and everything smelled faintly of barn. By now, you might be wondering, did peasants ever eat anything sweet? Sort of, but not in the way we think of today. Sugar was a luxury, imported at great cost from faraway lands. So peasants relied on honey if they could get it. Honey was precious, not just for sweetening, but for brewing mead, the world's oldest form of alcohol. A jar of honey could be bartered for tools, cloth, or even livestock, which is why, for most people, it was used sparingly, perhaps drizzled on a feast day cake made from oats and dried fruit. If that sounds nice, don't worry. It probably wasn't. And what about vegetables? They existed, but they were very green. Leeks, onions, cabbages, and peas made up the bulk of the diet. Carrots existed too, though they were not the cheerful orange kind we know. Medieval carrots were purple, yellow, or white, and often woody in texture. Root vegetables were beloved mainly because they could survive winter. Turnips, parsnips, and beets featured heavily. There's even a medieval joke about peasants and turnips. Though, like most medieval jokes, it's only funny if you've been malnourished for several years. And that brings us to the emotional heart of it all. Food wasn't just about eating. It was about survival, status, and a kind of grim pride. Bread and ale weren't luxuries. They were identity. To be a peasant was to live at the mercy of the harvest, the church calendar, and your Lord's mood. Every meal was a reflection of the weather, the soil, and the whims of those above you. And yet, within those limits, people adapted. They developed traditions, recipes, and communal habits. They made do, because even if your bread was gray and your soup was more weed than vegetable, it was yours. Let's drift for a bit, because next time we'll wander a little deeper into the medieval kitchen itself. The pots, the hearths, the daily rituals of cooking in a world without forks or soap. But for now, take a slow breath. Because somehow, despite it all, medieval peasants endured, fueled by ale, turnips, and the quiet miracle of staying alive. The silence after the thrones. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history. If you've got the lights dimmed and your tea cooling just a little too quickly, that's perfect. Because tonight's story isn't about glory or conquest. It's about what happens after all that. After the palace doors close and the voices fade, and the empire that once ruled the world stops existing. We're talking about eunuchs, the men without heirs, without families, but somehow with more power than anyone else in the empire, until suddenly they didn't. When you think of royal courts, you probably imagine kings, queens, generals, or scheming advisors with impressive facial hair. But in almost every great empire, from China to Byzantium, from the Abbasids to the Ottomans, there were also the eunuchs, the quiet, watchful, perfectly trusted servants of the throne. Trusted, of course, because they couldn't exactly start a dynasty of their own, and for centuries that made them indispensable until, one by one, the empires that employed them began to collapse. So what happens to a man whose entire identity depends on serving a throne that suddenly doesn't exist? Tonight, we're going to find out. Let's start gently with the idea itself. The eunuch. It's one of those historical words that instantly makes people wince, or laugh nervously, or both. But for most of recorded history, being a eunuch wasn't unusual. It was a career path, in some cases, a very good one. In imperial China, for example, the title of eunuch of the inner court could make you richer than any scholar official. In Byzantium, you could command armies, run the treasury, or even stand in for the emperor himself. The Ottomans placed eunuchs at the very center of the palace, guarding the harem, carrying the sultan's orders, and, often enough, making their own. The idea was simple. A eunuch had no wife, no children, and therefore, supposedly, no ambitions, which was, naturally, a terrible miscalculation, because people without heirs often develop very creative ways of holding on to power. But we're not here for their glory days. We're here for the morning after the empire fell, when all that power evaporated, and the eunuchs were left, quite literally, without a role in the world. Let's drift first to Beijing. In the early 20th century, the Forbidden City still stood in all its red and gold perfection. But the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, had already collapsed. The young Emperor Puyi had been forced to abdicate in 1912 at the tender age of 6. And yet, the eunuchs stayed, hundreds of them, possibly even 1,000, depending on the count. They stayed because, for them, there was nowhere else to go. They had lived their entire lives behind those vermilion gates, serving the Son of Heaven, polishing jade ornaments, trimming candle wicks, and memorizing the delicate hierarchies of who was allowed to bow to whom. The Republic of China didn't have much use for any of that. But when Puyi was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City for a few years, he was still treated, technically, as the emperor, and the eunuchs continued to serve him. Imagine the scene. An emperor without an empire, living in a shrinking pocket of ritual and nostalgia, attended by men whose entire profession had just been erased. They spent their days sweeping courtyards that no one visited anymore, rehearsing ceremonies for audiences that never came. For centuries, eunuchs had been both feared and resented. They were seen as scheming parasites, the manipulators behind every imperial scandal. Now, stripped of their influence, most of them were simply sad. When Puyi was finally expelled from the palace in 1924, after a military coup, decided that former emperors were no longer politically convenient, the eunuchs were dismissed. 2. And here's the part. No one really talks about. Many of them were old. Most were uneducated. All were physically marked by their condition, by their accents, by the elaborate tattoos some wore to show palace allegiance. They had nowhere to return to. A few tried to become temple caretakers. Some begged on the streets. Others sold off imperial relics. Bits of silk, old fans, even scrolls, just to survive. There's one haunting photograph, taken in the 1930s, of a small group of elderly eunuchs sitting outside a Beijing tea house. Their clothes are ragged, but their posture is impeccable. Straight backs, hands folded neatly in their laps. You can tell they still think of themselves as imperial servants, even though the world has entirely forgotten what that means. A few ended up as curiosities. Puyi himself, after his capture by the Japanese and later by the Communists, recalled being astonished to meet some of his old eunuchs still alive in the 1950s, eking out a living polishing brass or sweeping temples. They were relics of a vanished order, moving like ghosts through a city that no longer had a palace at its heart. But the story didn't end there. Because the eunuchs weren't just a Chinese phenomenon, they existed almost everywhere. Power became hereditary, and paranoia set in. So let's drift westward, across the steppe and the sea, to Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, where eunuchs had once been some of the most powerful men in Europe. In Byzantium, castration wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was career development. A well-placed eunuch could become a bishop, a general, even the emperor's chief minister. They were considered pure in the theological sense, free from the temptations of the flesh, which somehow made them perfect for handling enormous sums of money and political intrigue. Because, naturally, they did both. One of the most famous, Basil Lecapenos, ran the Byzantine treasury for decades. He owned palaces, ships, and estates across the empire. He was so rich, it took the emperor himself several years to dismantle his fortune after Basil's downfall. So when Byzantium finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, you can imagine what that meant for the eunuchs who survived. Their empire had been shrinking for centuries, and with it, their entire bureaucratic ecosystem. The Byzantines, being thorough record keepers, left behind plenty of complaints about how the eunuchs were corrupt, greedy, and meddlesome, which, frankly, was true of everyone else in the palace, too. But after the fall, the chronicles fall silent. A few eunuchs probably converted and continued their lives under Ottoman rule. Some may have been absorbed into the Ottoman harem system, where their skills, organization, secrecy, and absolute obedience were still in high demand. Others likely met quieter fates. Without an emperor to serve, their very existence was an awkward reminder of a world that no longer existed. In Ottoman Istanbul, though, the eunuchs thrived again, at least for a while. The palace system was almost designed for them. Let's wander now through the Topkapi Palace, sometime around the 17th century. It's dawn. The marble floors are still cool from the night air. Inside the harem, a maze of courtyards, apartments, and whispering corridors, the black eunuchs are already awake. They were known as the Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch, and his subordinates. Imported mainly from East Africa, they were placed in charge of guarding the Sultan's wives, concubines, and daughters. In practice, they were also the keepers of secrets, the carriers of messages, and often the mediators between the harem and the outside world. The chief eunuch was one of the most powerful men in the empire. He had the Sultan's ear, literally, as he was often the one whispering into it. He controlled access, appointments, and information. He could make or break viziers, arrange marriages, and occasionally decide who lived or died. It's not hard to see why later chroniclers referred to them as the shadow behind the throne. But like all shadows, their power vanished with the light. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was staggering under reform, revolt, and European interference. Modernization crept in. Palaces were rebuilt in European style. Women began appearing in public again. The harem system, once the center of imperial life, became increasingly ceremonial, and the eunuchs, once indispensable, became archaic. In 1909, after the Young Turk Revolution, the office of the chief black eunuch was officially abolished. Just like in China, hundreds of eunuchs suddenly found themselves unemployed. Some stayed in Istanbul, serving minor roles in mosques or charitable endowments. Others, according to travelers' reports, simply drifted into obscurity. One British visitor in 1910 described meeting an aged black eunuch, once a servant of Abdul Hamid, who now sells prayer beads in the shadow of the Blue Mosque. He had no family, no savings, no legal recognition, but he still referred to himself proudly by his old palace title. There's something both tragic and oddly dignified about that. Men stripped of their place in the world, yet still carrying themselves as servants of an empire that no longer existed. If you step back and look at it, the story of the eunuchs after empire is really a story about what happens when entire systems collapse. They were human beings shaped entirely by bureaucracy and ritual. When those vanished, they had no framework left, socially, legally, even emotionally. A man who had spent 40 years managing the emperor's tea service or controlling the royal correspondence couldn't exactly become a farmer, And because most eunuchs were castrated in childhood, they had no families to fall back on. No sons, no nephews, no inheritance networks, just the memory of power, and a lifetime of obedience to a vanished throne. How did royalty actually go to the bathroom? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world of thrones, crowns, and very questionable plumbing. A time when kings ruled vast empires, commanded armies, signed treaties, and still had to figure out, quietly and with some dignity, where exactly to relieve themselves. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and maybe take a moment to appreciate the miracle of modern indoor plumbing. Because tonight, we're wandering through the surprisingly undignified history of royal bodily functions. It's a story of luxury and filth, of golden chambers and chamber pots, and of how the most powerful people in Europe tried, often unsuccessfully, to make nature seem noble. Let's start, as we so often do, in the Middle Ages, when castles were beautiful from a distance and horrifying up close. Most medieval castles didn't have bathrooms, not in the modern sense. They had garderobes, small stone closets built into the outer walls, often over a moat, a narrow wooden bench with a hole in it, leading to the great outdoors. If you were lucky, there was a shaft that emptied straight down into running water. If you weren't, it collected in a cesspit below, waiting for some unfortunate servant to deal with it later. The name garderobe literally means clothes room, because medieval people believed the ammonia fumes from waste helped kill lice. Yes, the same place they relieved themselves was also where they stored their clothing, royal efficiency at its finest. Now, not all garderobes were equal. A king's version might have been spacious, even decorated. Some were lined with wood for comfort. A few had tiny windows, ventilation, or, if you were particularly unlucky, a drafty view of the moat below. In grander palaces, garderobes were tucked away in turrets or behind tapestries for a bit of privacy. But privacy itself was a flexible concept. Doors were rare, curtains were optional, and soundproofing, tragically, had not yet been invented. You can imagine how that went during council meetings. Of course, the truly elite didn't always use these medieval sky latrines themselves, because where there's royalty, there are attendants, and among those attendants was one of the strangest, most prestigious jobs in royal history, the groom of the stool. Yes, that was a real title. The groom of the stool was the man responsible for assisting the king with his most private needs. His duties included preparing the royal commode, presenting water and linen for washing, and maintaining records of the monarch's digestive health. It was not, as you might expect, a humiliating position. It was an honor, because the groom of the stool had unparalleled access to the king, literally and politically. When you're the person standing beside the monarch in his most vulnerable moments, you hear things. You become trusted. You know secrets. Some grooms of the stool became powerful advisers, privy to private thoughts that no courtier or minister could ever overhear. It's hard to imagine that today. Someone rising to power because they handed the king a towel. But that's how Tudor politics worked. Henry VIII, for instance, had several grooms of the stool, each of whom gained remarkable influence. Sir Anthony Denny was one of them, and when Henry lay dying, it was Denny who was allowed into his bedchamber to break the news that he was not long for this world. A career that began beside the royal commode ended beside the royal deathbed. A full, if somewhat fragrant, circle. Henry himself had an elaborate setup. His portable toilet, his close stool, was a padded, leather-covered box containing a removable chamber pot. It was embroidered, of course, because this was still Henry VIII we're talking about. Everything had to remind you that he was special. Even the seat of his throne's less glamorous twin. He traveled with multiple such stools, along with perfumed cloths, scented water, and attendants carrying, well, buckets. Luxury, it turns out, has limits. Let's drift a bit further into the Renaissance. When royalty began to embrace hygiene, or at least the illusion of it, at Versailles, Louis XIV and his court represented the pinnacle of Baroque excess. But beneath the perfume and gold leaf, things were rather less civilized. Versailles housed thousands of courtiers, but very few actual toilets. There were some commodes à la chaise, elegant chairs with hidden chamber pots, but most people used whatever corner, hallway, or stairwell was available. Contemporary visitors complained about the smell. One ambassador described Versailles as perfumed and pestilential in equal measure, which feels about right. The Sun King himself had a private stool in his bedchamber, attended by a valet who would hand him warm cloths afterward. Yet, according to accounts, Louis was so sociable that he often held meetings during his morning routine. Ministers would discuss matters of state while he sat calmly on his gilded chair, conducting royal business in both senses of the phrase. Imagine being the Duke of Burgundy, trying to negotiate taxes while pretending not to notice what the king was doing behind a curtain of brocade. The royal commode at Versailles wasn't a plumbing marvel. It was still a removable chamber pot, made of silver, porcelain, or occasionally gold. Servants emptied it discreetly, though discreetly in a palace of 3,000 people is a relative term. At night, the hallways were lined with used pots awaiting collection. The smell of Versailles was said to linger in the mind and the lungs long after one departed, yet this was the height of sophistication. Tartuffe had convinced itself that filth, if wrapped in silk and sprayed with rose water, was no longer filth at all across the Channel. The English court was no better. Elizabeth I, though famed for her poise, was no stranger to the chamber pot. Her palaces, like Hampton Court, had garderobes and privies aplenty, but plumbing was primitive. Her personal close stool was carried everywhere she went, and its emptying was handled by the same office, the groom of the stool, that served her father. Only, in her case, the position was given to trusted ladies rather than gentlemen. One of Elizabeth's attendants, Lady Mary Sidney, was said to be so loyal that she would carry the stool herself, even on journeys, which is one of those details history politely forgets to mention in textbooks. The Tudors were masters of ceremony, and even their bodily functions came wrapped in protocol. Every act had an order of precedence. Every task had an official title. It was bureaucracy, but deeply personal. By the 18th century, the problem of royal sanitation had grown too large to ignore. Literally, palaces were vast, crowded, and lacking in infrastructure. The smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was political. Cleanliness was becoming fashionable, and kings wanted to be seen as enlightened. So, enter the early innovators of plumbing. At the Palace of Holyrood in Scotland, there were experiments with water closets as early as the 1700s, essentially early flush toilets, using gravity and running water. George III later had one installed at Windsor Castle, though servants reportedly complained that it was too loud for royal use. Privacy, again, had limits. Meanwhile, in France, engineers proposed complex sewage systems for Versailles. Most of them were ignored, partly because Louis XV preferred to spend money on fountains that sprayed water into the air, not away from it. Even so, attitudes were shifting. Cleanliness became tied to morality and modernity. A well-drained palace was the mark of progress. By the 19th century, with the advent of indoor plumbing, royal bathrooms finally began to resemble something we'd recognize. Queen Victoria, ever the enthusiast for domestic improvement, had flushing toilets installed in several royal residences. Her diaries even mention her curiosity about them, though not, thankfully, in great detail. Her consort, Prince Albert, reportedly took a keen interest in sanitation reform. He oversaw the installation of improved waste systems at Windsor and Buckingham Palace, ensuring that, for once, royal waste left the building with dignity. It's oddly fitting that the man who helped revolutionize British industry also revolutionized British bathrooms. And yet, even in this age of progress, the old rituals lingered. Royal households still maintained layers of etiquette around privacy. Servants announced themselves with knocks. Before entering bathing rooms, certain attendants were responsible for towels, others for hot water. Nothing was spontaneous. To be royal meant that even the most basic human need came with an audience. Imagine living your entire life surrounded by people and realizing that solitude was a luxury even kings couldn't always afford and still had to figure out, quietly and with some dignity, where exactly to relieve themselves. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and maybe take a moment to appreciate the miracle of modern indoor plumbing. Because tonight, we're wandering through the surprisingly undignified history of royal bodily functions. Let's pause here for a moment. Because the story of royal bathrooms isn't really about plumbing. It's about the strange intersection of power and humanity. The higher you climbed in status, the less human you were allowed to be in public. And yet, behind the guilt and ceremony, every monarch still faced the same simple reality. Nature calls, and you have to answer. Kings, queens, emperors, all of them, sooner or later, found themselves on their own version of the throne, pondering matters both private and profound. And perhaps, in those quiet, perfumed chambers, they felt something that no courtier could ever admit aloud. A small, humbling reminder that beneath the crown, they were exactly like everyone else. Bones, burials, and the art of pretending death was normal. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where death wasn't a distant thought. It was a daily neighbor. So if you're settling in for the night, blanket tucked just right, maybe a candle flickering somewhere in the corner. Perfect. Because tonight, we're not talking about knights or kings or castles. We're talking about the people who had to deal with what happened after. Specifically, what medieval people actually did with their dead. And if you're imagining solemn funerals and peaceful graveyards, I have some news for you. It was rarely solemn, occasionally peaceful, and very, very strange, because the Middle Ages didn't believe in letting go of the dead. They believed in keeping them around. Let's start gently, though, with the basic problem. When someone dies today, there's a system. You call the right people, fill out the paperwork, and the rest happens quietly behind closed doors. But in the medieval world, there were no closed doors. Not for this. If someone in your family died, you handled it. Literally. You washed the body. You dressed it. You kept it in your home, often for days, while neighbors and relatives stopped by to look, to weep, to gossip, and occasionally to critique the decorations. Medieval people didn't hide death away. They lived with it side by side. The dead person wasn't considered gone just yet. More like in transition, somewhere between alive and eternally hopeful. So, naturally, you'd want to make them comfortable for the journey. That meant wrapping the body carefully in a shroud, sprinkling herbs to cover the smell, though that only helped a little, and sometimes, if you were wealthy enough, placing coins over the eyes, not so much for the ferryman of myth, but to keep the eyelids politely shut. The church controlled the ground, specifically holy ground. If you wanted your relative buried in a churchyard, you needed permission and usually a small payment. It was believed that proximity to a church's altar made it easier for the soul to reach heaven. The closer the grave was to the altar, the higher the spiritual real estate value, which meant, naturally, that the wealthy and powerful were buried right up against the walls of the church, sometimes inside it. The poor, on the other hand, were farther out, usually around the edges of the yard, occasionally beyond the fence altogether. And because land was limited, graves weren't exactly permanent. When the churchyard filled up, which happened often, the older bones were dug up, cleaned off, and stacked neatly in a charnel house or ossuary to make room for the next round. Imagine that. You go to visit your grandmother's grave and find someone else politely occupying it, while her skull is now part of a tidy little wall display. The bones of saints, for example, were some of the most valuable things in Christendom. Bits of finger, jaw, or toe were stored in gold and crystal reliquaries, carried through towns, kissed by crowds, and occasionally fought over by rival churches. In one famous case, the city of Venice literally stole the body of St. Mark from Alexandria in 828, smuggling it out hidden under layers of pork because the Muslim customs officials wouldn't inspect unclean meat. It worked. The saint became Venice's official protector, and they built a cathedral to house him. So, yes, grave robbing was considered fine, if it was holy grave robbing. The cemeteries there were overflowing. The most famous, Les Innocents, had been in use for centuries, and by then it was more pit than yard. The smell alone could reportedly knock a horse unconscious. Bodies were layered on top of each other, decomposing into a thick, oily soil that the grave diggers sometimes sold as fertilizer. Because, of course, they did. Eventually, when the situation became unbearable, and the bread in the nearby market started absorbing the aroma, the city decided to do something. So they began moving bones underground into what would later become the Paris catacombs. By the time they were done, the remains of over 6 million people had been stacked into tidy, symmetrical arrangements. Femurs here, skulls there. In dimly lit tunnels that stretch for miles beneath the city. Today, tourists walk through them with flashlights, but originally it was just an act of sanitation and a very medieval idea of organization. Because to medieval people, bones weren't meant to be hidden. They were meant to remind the living of where they were headed. Memento mori. Remember, you must die. It wasn't grim. It was practical, almost cheerful, in a resigned sort of way. Let's wander over to England for a moment, because the English were particularly inventive when it came to burial. By the later Middle Ages, they'd developed a system called the divided body. Essentially, the rich realized they could die in multiple places at once. If you were a nobleman with lands in several counties, or a king with several favorite cathedrals, you might have your heart buried in one church, your entrails in another, and your body somewhere else entirely. Richard the Lionheart, for example, managed to distribute himself across 3 different regions: his heart in Rouen, his guts in Chalus, and his body at Fontevraud Abbey. Because apparently the afterlife favored multitasking. It was also a clever political move. Each place got a piece of royal sanctity, and each church, conveniently, got pilgrims. But not all medieval burials were so refined. Let's drift down to the local level, to the kind of small village where most people lived. If you were poor, your burial was basic: a simple shroud, no coffin, and a shallow grave. Sometimes the same grave was reused a few years later. Once nature had made room, if you were unlucky enough to die during a famine or plague, things got even simpler. During the Black Death, for instance, bodies piled up faster than anyone could bury them. Mass graves, long trenches, were dug, filled, and covered over. Sometimes priests just blessed the whole pit from a distance. But even in times of chaos, there was still ritual, still the sense that the body mattered. priests would sprinkle holy water, say a few words, maybe drop a cross or a sprig of herbs on top. It wasn't much, but it was something, because no matter how messy the world got, medieval people believed that the body and soul were still linked, and that one day, at the end of time, that body would be resurrected. So even if you were dumped in a pit with 50 others, you could still, theoretically, find all your bits again later, theologically speaking at least. Now, not everyone who was buried stayed buried. Medieval Europe was full of reasons to dig people up again. Some pious, some less so. Sometimes it was about sainthood. If someone died with a reputation for holiness, the church might exhume their body to check for signs of divine favor. The famous incorruptibility. If the body hadn't decayed or smelled pleasant, that was taken as proof of sanctity. Of course, medieval climates being what they were, this could be misleading. Cold, dry conditions could preserve a corpse quite nicely, whether or not the person had been particularly saintly. Still, it made for great publicity. Whole crowds would gather to see the freshly exhumed holy man or woman, and bits of the body would be carefully separated to create new relics for distant churches. It was death as marketing. Really? Then there were the less saintly reasons for reopening graves. Sometimes it was suspicion. If a village believed someone had died under unusual circumstances, or if they thought the dead were somehow restless, they'd dig them up to make sure. In Eastern Europe especially, this gave rise to what we now call vampire burials. Bodies were found with stakes through their chests, stones wedged into their mouths, or heads placed between their knees, all measures meant to keep them from getting up again. To the people doing it, this wasn't superstition. It was pest control. If a disease spread through a village, they might assume the dead were feeding on the living from beyond the grave. And since understanding of germs was a few centuries away, the logical solution was, well, decapitation, calmly performed, of course. Meanwhile, at the opposite end of the social scale, royal funerals were extravaganzas of denial. Medieval monarchs, being obsessed with legacy, made sure their deaths were treated like a performance. Take King Henry V of England, who died in 1422. His body was embalmed, stuffed with herbs, wrapped in fine linen, placed in a lead coffin, and paraded for weeks through towns and cathedrals. Along the way, wax effigies of him, dressed in full royal regalia, were displayed above the coffin, because rigor mortis made real corpses inconveniently unregal. The effigies were eerily lifelike, made to preserve the illusion that the king was merely resting. It was part reverence, part denial, and part excellent theater. The people loved it. By the time the procession reached Westminster, the body inside had long since begun to decompose. But that didn't matter. The spectacle had done its job. The king was now a legend, the stench politely ignored. All of this, really, tells us something simple about the Middle Ages. They never stopped negotiating with death. It was everywhere, in plagues, childbirth, war, famine, and because it was inescapable, they learned to live with it, touch it, decorate it, and sometimes, quite literally, build architecture out of it. To a medieval mind, death wasn't a horror. It was a continuation. The living and the dead coexisted, not in some ghostly sense, but practically, physically. The dead weren't gone. They were just quieter roommates. Whispers, demons, and the madness of kings, hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where nobody had therapists. But everyone had opinions. If you've got the lights low, the blanket tucked in just right, and your phone at that perfect distance where you don't have to hold it up, good. Because we're not diving into medical textbooks or Freud's couch tonight. We're wandering through something older, stranger, and a little more superstitious. We're going to talk about madness, but not the way we talk about it now, with diagnoses, treatment plans, and acronyms that sound like government agencies. No, tonight we're looking at what madness meant before psychology existed. When people still thought melancholy was caused by too much black bile, and exorcism counted as therapy. It's a long, quiet story, sometimes sad, often absurd, and occasionally disturbingly funny. So, settle in. Because before the asylum, before the Freudian couch, and long before self-care Sundays, there were mad kings, melancholic monks, possessed peasants, and entire cities convinced the devil was renting space in their neighbors. Let's start softly. In a world that didn't yet know what a mind really was. In the early Middle Ages, Europe didn't think in terms of brains or chemistry. The self was a soul, not a system. So when someone's behavior turned strange, when they started laughing at walls or refusing food, hearing voices or wandering naked through the streets, people didn't ask, "What's wrong with their brain?" They asked, "What's wrong with their soul?" That distinction made all the difference. Madness wasn't seen as illness. It was a condition, a symptom of moral or spiritual imbalance. It could mean you were cursed, possessed, divinely inspired, or simply melancholic. And those possibilities ranged from holy to horrifying. For example, and there are so many of these. Some people thought madness was a divine gift. Prophets, visionaries, hermits, and mystics often behaved exactly like the mentally ill would today. They fasted until delirium, spoke in riddles, and had vivid visions of angels and demons, and yet, rather than being locked away, many were revered. Saint Catherine of Siena starved, herself nearly to death, and claimed to drink only the blood of Christ. In her visions, Joan of Arc heard voices from saints telling her to lead an army, and everyone just sort of nodded and said, "Ah, yes, perfectly reasonable," because divine madness, if it seemed useful, was tolerated. But if your visions told you to burn the crops or speak against the king, well, then it was clearly the devil's work. Conveniently, of course. In the early medieval mind, madness was almost always external. Something done to you. You were bewitched, possessed, or afflicted by evil spirits. The cure? Not medicine, not rest, usually. Prayer, fasting, or a strategic beating. Monks wrote down all sorts of remedies. One 10th century English leech book, that's a medical text, recommends for someone suffering madness or frenzy that you carve words from the Gospel of John onto a loaf of bread, soak it in holy water, and feed it to them. Others suggested tying herbs around the patient's neck. And if that failed, the more hands-on method was exorcism. Exorcisms were not the dramatic Hollywood kind. They were long, slow, repetitive. Priests chanting for hours while everyone hoped the devil would eventually get bored and leave. Sometimes the mad person recovered, possibly because they were dehydrated, exhausted, and finally quiet. Other times they didn't, which was blamed on weak faith or insufficient Latin pronunciation. But let's drift into the royal courts, because when kings went mad, everyone noticed and documented it obsessively. And few did royal madness quite like King Charles VI of France. He was born in 1368, in the middle of the 100 Years' War, because of course he was, and crowned at 11. By his 20s, Charles was handsome, clever, and popular. People called him Charles the Beloved, which, in hindsight, was tempting fate, because by his mid-30s, Charles began unraveling. It started one summer in 1392. The king and his knights were riding through a forest when a servant accidentally dropped a spear. The clang echoed, and Charles snapped. He turned on his companions, drew his sword, and started attacking them. By the time he was restrained, several were dead. When he woke up, he had no memory of what he'd done. That incident marked the start of decades of episodes. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass. Literally, he'd sit motionless for hours, terrified that if anyone touched him, he'd shatter. Servants had to sew iron rods into his clothes to convince him he wouldn't break. He also forgot his own name, ran screaming through corridors, and occasionally refused to bathe. Not out of royal stubbornness, but because he no longer recognized himself in the mirror. Physicians, priests, and astrologers all tried to cure him. One suggested bloodletting, always a crowd favorite. Another blamed the heat of youth and prescribed cold baths. And, naturally, his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, consulted mystics and burned herbs in the royal bedchamber, which probably helped exactly as much as you'd imagine. The court nicknamed him Charles the Mad, though to his face they called him Your Majesty. Charles's madness wasn't unique. The royal archives of Europe are practically an early diagnostic manual of hereditary instability. Take Joanna of Castile, often called Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yes, the same ones who funded Columbus, and inherited a powerful kingdom. But Joanna's life was not well managed. She married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, who was, by all accounts, handsome but also shallow, manipulative, and serially unfaithful. Joanna adored him. He, unfortunately, adored everyone else. After years of neglect, humiliation, and stress, Joanna's mind began to fracture. She'd fly into rages, refuse to eat, and reportedly talk to herself for hours. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, possibly poisoned, though that's another story, Joanna refused to believe it. She kept his coffin with her, literally. She traveled across Spain with the coffin in tow, opening it periodically to look at him. Sometimes she'd kiss the corpse. Sometimes she'd talk to it. She ordered that no women were allowed near the coffin, not even nuns, because she was still jealous. Modern historians debate whether she was truly insane or simply traumatized, but to her family, madness was a convenient excuse. Her father locked her in a convent for the rest of her life. She stayed there 46 years because sometimes in royal politics, madness was just another word for inconvenient. But medieval people didn't just pathologize kings and queens. Ordinary people could go mad too, though they rarely got the same medical attention. In most villages, a person acting strangely might be pitied, feared, or mocked, depending on the day. Some were thought to be touched by God, others by the devil. Communities dealt with them however they could. Sometimes that meant leaving food at their door. Other times, it meant chaining them in barns, or, if they were lucky, letting them wander freely as local eccentrics. The village fool, or innocent, was a real social role. Many towns had one or two people who weren't quite right, but were seen as harmless and maybe even blessed. They became mascots of a sort, tolerated, teased, occasionally fed. As long as they didn't disturb church services or set anything on fire, they were allowed to exist. It was a rough sort of compassion, but still compassion. Of course, medicine, or what passed for it, eventually tried to make sense of all this. The guiding theory for over 1,000 years was the four humors. You've probably heard of them: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to Galen, the ancient physician everyone quoted, but no one really read, the balance of these fluids determined both health and temperament. 2. Much blood made you sanguine, cheerful but reckless. Too much phlegm made you phlegmatic, calm but lazy. Too much yellow bile made you choleric, angry and proud. And too much black bile made you melancholic, sad, gloomy, maybe a poet. If you went too far in any direction, you risked madness. So, if you were depressed, the problem wasn't emotional pain. It was simply an excess of black bile. If you were manic, you had too much yellow bile. The cure was to remove some of it. Hence, leeches and enemas, and the occasional strategic vomiting. Early physicians were deeply committed to the idea that if you could just drain enough bodily fluid, your personality would improve, which, to be fair, sometimes worked, because dehydration can make anyone docile. But alongside medicine and religion, there was always one more authority on madness: the community. In a world without psychiatrists, public opinion was the diagnostic tool. If your neighbors said you were mad, you were. If they said you were inspired, you were. It was collective storytelling masquerading as health. Care. That's how entire groups could decide someone was possessed, or how towns in Germany and France could suddenly start dancing uncontrollably, what we now call dancing mania or St. Vitus's dance. Imagine hundreds of people in the middle of a square, dancing for days until they collapsed. Some died of exhaustion. Others had to be carried away to chapels to dance it out before the relics of saints. To modern ears, it sounds like hysteria. To them, it was divine punishment, or sometimes divine opportunity, since priests used it to sell more relics. Because naturally, someone had to profit from madness. The royal nose knows hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before deodorant, before toothpaste, before anyone thought that bathing more than once a month might be a good idea. So go ahead, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe light a candle. Or don't, if that feels historically authentic. Because tonight, we're wandering through the perfumed halls and occasionally rancid corridors of medieval nobility. We're asking a simple question. What did medieval nobles actually smell like? And, just as importantly, did anyone care? Because if there's one thing history proves over and over again, it's that rich people have always smelled a little better than everyone else. But not by much. Let's start with the basics. In the Middle Ages, most people believed that bathing was risky. Not because they didn't like being clean exactly, but because they thought water opened the pores, letting in disease, which, to be fair, in a time when rivers doubled as open sewers, wasn't completely wrong. Doctors? Well, doctors warned that bathing could weaken your vital humors, and humors were very important back then. You had to keep them balanced, hot, cold, wet, dry. Everything from your personality to your scent was blamed on them. So, many nobles preferred to bathe with cloths. They'd rub themselves down with linen soaked in rose water or vinegar, then call it a day. No rinsing, no scrubbing. Just a gentle dab and a prayer. Royal courts did have baths, of course. Luxurious. Wooden tubs lined with linen, filled with water, perfumed with herbs. Lavender, rosemary, thyme. A bath wasn't for hygiene, though. It was an event. In some castles, the bath would be set up in the bedchamber near the fire. Servants would pour buckets of hot water, and the noble would recline, maybe sip wine, and discuss politics, or gossip about whoever hadn't been invited. Sometimes couples bathed together. Sometimes entire families did. Because why not? There wasn't much privacy in a castle anyway. But here's the thing. Even those grand baths didn't happen very often. A noble might bathe once a week if they were particularly clean, once a month if they were normal, and twice a year if they were, say, Philip II of Spain, which, by all accounts, he was. Now, we tend to imagine medieval nobles smelling like unwashed goats. But that's not quite right either. They actually smelled of cover-up, perfume, pomanders, scented gloves, rose water, layer upon layer of fragrant deception. Perfume was not sprayed but soaked into fabrics. Clothes were stored with sachets of herbs, dried flowers, and spices to mask any unfortunate undertones. Some nobles wore small metal balls, pomanders, filled with musk or ambergris, which is, unfortunately, whale vomit. A luxury item, if you can believe it. They believed these scents didn't just smell nice, they protected against disease. Bad smells, or miasmas, were thought to cause illness. So if you smelled good, you were safe, at least theoretically. Let's drift over to Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, or at least the legend of her. In the 14th century, someone invented Hungary water, a fragrant alcohol-based tonic made from rosemary and wine. It was supposed to rejuvenate the body, cure headaches, and, naturally, make you smell like divine royalty. The story goes that it was gifted to the aging queen, who used it so devotedly that she supposedly became so beautiful that the King of Poland proposed to her. She was 72 at the time, which, if true, is the world's earliest example of anti-aging marketing. We should pause and think about what these perfumes were masking. Castles weren't known for their fresh air. Inside, there were fires burning day and night. The air was thick with smoke, animal fat, damp wool, and people. Dogs and falcons wandered through the halls. Servants carried trays of food and chamber pots. Well, let's just say plumbing was not a royal strong suit. Even the cleanest noble couldn't entirely rise above the atmosphere. So perfumes weren't just luxury. They were survival. You might wonder about teeth. Did nobles have bad breath? Yes, they absolutely did. Toothbrushes weren't common in Europe until much later. Instead, people chewed herbs or used rough cloths to wipe their teeth. Tooth powders existed, made of burnt salt, crushed shells, or sage, but dentists did not. Henry VIII, who loved sweetmeats and wine, reportedly had blackened teeth by middle age. His courtiers copied him, because of course they did. Fashion always wins, even when it's terrible. Still, we can't paint all medieval nobles with one smelly brush. Regional differences mattered. In southern Europe, bathing culture lingered from the Roman world. Bathhouses remained in use far longer in Italy and Spain, often run by monasteries or civic authorities. People there were more likely to take a plunge, or at least a rinse, than their northern counterparts. In England or France, however, things cooled off fast. By the 14th century, public bathhouses had a reputation for extracurricular activities. Let's just say hot water wasn't the only attraction. The church frowned upon them, and soon bathing itself began to feel morally suspicious. So nobles retreated into private tubs and perfumed cloths, while peasants simply kept working. Let's wander, for a moment, into Charlemagne's bathing habits. He ruled in the 8th century, long before the smells good, feels bad philosophy of later medieval medicine took over. Charlemagne loved bathing. He built massive hot springs at Aachen and bathed daily, often with his friends, guards, and family, which sounds less like hygiene and more like an awkward team-building exercise, but still. He was, by early medieval standards, a very clean man. Unfortunately, his descendants did not inherit the habit. By the time of the later French kings, bathing had become rare again, though, interestingly, so had competence. If you were a noblewoman, your scent mattered even more. Ladies had entire arsenals of beauty aids: powdered rice, rose oil, violet water, civet musk. Hair was washed occasionally, but more often just sprinkled with scented powders and combed out with oils. And to protect the skin, they used lead-based creams, which, yes, caused slow poisoning. But at least you'd smell faintly floral while dyeing. Even garments were part of the olfactory hierarchy. Rich people wore linen closest to the body. Then, layers of silk and wool, all of which absorbed and retained perfumes beautifully. Peasants wore rough wool straight on the skin, which trapped sweat, mud, and everything else they came across. So even when nobles didn't bathe, they still smelled expensive. If you're wondering whether anyone actually cared about these differences, the answer is mostly yes. Scent was a social signal. A sweet smell meant purity, virtue, wealth. A foul one meant poverty, sin, or illness. People literally judged your moral worth by your aroma. In royal courts, smelling good wasn't just pleasant. It was political. Ambassadors were greeted in perfumed halls. Banquets were drenched in rose water. Even letters were sometimes scented before being sealed. The nobility lived in a cloud of symbolic fragrance. They smelled of sanctity, sophistication, and just enough deception to mask the occasional bathless fortnight. And yet, even the most perfumed noble couldn't escape time, because after a few centuries of roses, musk, and ambergris, the human nose adjusts. By the late 15th century, chroniclers began to note that nobles themselves were becoming numb to strong scents. Perfume recipes grew ever more elaborate, almost absurd. Mixes of cinnamon, clove, civet, sandalwood, and sometimes a hint of ground pearl, which, yes, was as expensive and pointless as it sounds. The more they tried to smell divine, the more they just smelled like a very rich apothecary. Because next, we're drifting deeper into the scented labyrinth, the strange rituals of courtly cleanliness, the rise of the perfumed glove, and the monarchs who thought bathing was for peasants. So, get comfortable. That said, bathing wasn't unheard of. In fact, in many places, it was downright fashionable. Public bathhouses existed across Europe, especially in the early Middle Ages. In cities like Paris, London, and Prague, you could find steamy wooden rooms where people soaked in tubs, shared gossip, and occasionally more than that. Because, as tends to happen, bathhouses quickly became associated with other pleasures. By the 14th century, many were less spa and more social experiment. Authorities periodically shut them down for reasons that ranged from morality to plague prevention. Still, for several centuries, a good bath was part of normal life for those who could afford the time and the coin. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, sometimes scented with herbs if you were fancy. The water wasn't pristine, but it was warm, and for a few blissful moments, you could pretend to be cleaner than you were. When bathhouses began closing during outbreaks of plague, because naturally they made it worse, people turned instead to linen. They'd change their undergarments more often, believing that clean linen absorbed impurities from the body. This was, in a roundabout way, true. Linen does absorb sweat. It also smells less terrible than wool. So, in a very medieval compromise, people decided, if you can't wash the body, wash the shirt. A world of layers. Speaking of shirts, let's talk fashion hygiene. Medieval Europeans wore layers, lots of them, undergarments of linen. Over those, tunics or gowns, cloaks, hoods, hats. For nobles, everything was elaborate. For peasants, simpler. But still layers upon layers. Speaking of shirts, let's talk fashion hygiene. Medieval Europeans wore layers, lots of them, undergarments of linen. Over those, tunics or gowns, cloaks, hoods, hats.